Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I guess it's the end of the day for you. It's the beginning of the day for me, and a good way to start the day. So I'll be talking with you about a topic I've always found of great interest, that of psychedelics and its potential role to healing and to medicine. I've been fascinated in this area, really going back to when I went off to college in the late 60s. It was hard to miss the issue. I found it quite fascinating and maintained my interest over the years, and then had the great opportunity to conduct some research starting in the late 80s, early 90s, when it finally became feasible again to conduct human research with psychedelics. It had been, because of its controversial background and history in the 50s and 60s, it was deemed to be too hot to handle, too dangerous to study for a long period of time. But by the early 90s, our group at Harbor UCLA in Los Angeles and another group in New Mexico led by Rick Strassman looking at DMT. We were looking at MDMA. We were allowed to conduct the first phase 1 normal volunteer study. So today I'll talk with you about just a range of issues involving psychedelics and with some specific focus on a study we conducted in the early 2000s, first decade of the 2000s, kind of piloting the psilocybin treatment of advanced cancer anxiety study. And at the end of the study, I'll share with you a little information about a very new study that we're hopefully very shortly going to be starting, a multi-site study looking at the use of a psilocybin treatment model for individuals approaching the end of life who have severe levels of demoralization. So that'd be the primary variable we'd be looking at. And it'll be a multi-site study and with a kind of rather ambitious goal of studying well over 100 subjects. I'll talk with you a little bit about that study and why we're held up at the moment, but we're very hopeful and optimistic that we'll be able to start with the early in the new year. So here we have my obligatory financial relationship disclosures. These are mostly foundations that have supported our research. I'm a founding board member of the Hefter Research Institute, which has been dedicated for the past 30 years to facilitate high quality research in medical settings and conducted using rigorous methodologies. And you can see where else we receive some financial support. So let's just go right into this. Let's talk about the state of mental health treatment in the Western world. We know in the United States that in spite of rising rates of funding being allocated for treatment of mental health, particularly in the public sector, we find over the last several years, rates of all sorts of mental illness rising very sharply, suicide rates rising. And this slide doesn't even reflect the impact of the pandemic, which has created a crisis in mental health in our country and I assume elsewhere around the world. For instance, a couple of days ago in our local paper, the LA Times, there was a very large article looking at the increasing rates of suicide in adolescents, and an issue of great concern, an issue which was always challenging to our culture, but in the wake of the pandemic and prolonged isolation and the generalized anxiety, out in our world, and kids being cut off from real relationships, being home and having to limit their activities to social media, it has become very, very problematic, great crisis. So, and even before the pandemic, we're well aware that our conventional treatment models were limited in regards to their efficacy. For example, the very popular SSRIs are really only effective for about half the patients they treat, and there are vast pools of patients who are not amenable to standard treatments, and we haven't had a new model of treatment since I'd say the 70s and early 80s, when the traditional when traditionally psychoanalysis had held sway as kind of leading the field and being the prominent spokespeople. So the question arises: is it time for a new shift in how we conceptualize what's going on with people coming to us for help? And do we have any new treatment models which may even call for very different paradigms of understanding? So paradigm shift. The American philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn developed in the early 70s concept of a paradigm shift, which is defined as an important change that happens when the usual way of thinking about or doing something is replaced by a new and very different way. So are we ready to look at psychiatric patients as from the vantage point of anything other than a kind of psychobiologic reductionistic approach? So, and if you recall, my title referred to paradigm shift, but are we ready? And it's with a question mark. Are we ready? It's I'd like to hear your views as well. So I've always been very interested in what do we call these compounds, and the three I think most popular terms or most prevalent terms have been psychedelic, entheogen, and hallucinogen. Psychedelic is the most popular term, and as my old, very dear friend Jace Calloway, who I believe is here at this talk today, used to assert with me that psychedelic is far and away the preferred term, and it comes from it comes from the Greek, translated out as mind manifesting, and it was the term was invented by Humphrey Osmond in an exchange of letters with Aldous Huxley. They would write in verse to one another, and Huxley wrote to Osmond, to make this trivial world sublime, take 0.5 gram of phanerothine. Phanerothine being a term that was being batted around to cover these compounds. And Osmond responded, to fathom hell or soar angelic, take a pinch of psychedelic. And that term took hold and became very popular. But just looking at some of the other interesting terms, entheogen, reflecting on the capacity of some, though not all, of psychedelics and psychedelic experience to induce a powerful psychospiritual experience. Then there's hallucinogen, which has a somewhat bad reputation, considered as a pathologization of the psychedelic phenomena. But as my old friend Ralph Metzner explained to me once, the Latin root of the word hallucinogen is hallucinare, which translates out as mind wandering, mind journeying, mind traveling, or tripping, as you will. And then a series of other terms. Amongst these, my favorites are fantasticants. I think that was a Louis Lewin term. Mysticomimetics is an important term. It was psychotomimetic was the first descriptive name for psychedelic effects, but that was found to be not that accurate in many respects. This was not a good model to study schizophrenia, as was determined by the early investigators in the 50s. and early 60s. These are the other names. And I've personally, I've preferred hallucinogens. I'll promote my book here, my new book, published in 2021 with Jim Grigsby at the University of Colorado. This first textbook, formal textbook, I believe, in the field of hallucinogens. So we felt in a medical context, hallucinogens was the traditional term, the more formal scientific term, and the term we elected to use. But all of these terms have their value. They all have their pros, they all have their cons, and they're all great sources of delightful debate amongst friends. How to call these extraordinarily unique compounds. So, looking at some of the pharmacology, get this out of here. Blocking my. Good. Okay. Looking at the pharmacology of hallucinogens. Most people don't realize that hallucinogens or psychedelics played and you'll see that I'll be going back and forth using psychedelic and hallucinogen. That's just how it flows. They did play a role in in laboratory work, looking at the very important neurotransmitter serotonin, and were involved in its discovery. Daniel X. Friedman, who had at one time had been the chairman of psychiatry at the University of Chicago, did a laboratory study using non-human primates, injecting into the research monkeys a radioligand tagged LSD, and then with the imaging technology they had at that time, took pictures of the brain and found that certain areas lit up, and these turned out to be the areas that were most richly populated with serotonergic neuronal systems. So LSD played a significant role in our developing understanding of the of neurotransmitter systems. We know that they are agonists to the 5-HT2A receptors. Franz Vollenweider in Zurich did some very elegant work demonstrating that ketanserin, a 5-HT2A blocker, a 5-HT2A antagonist, can block the effect of a classic hallucinogen. And we also know that repeated administration leads to the rapid development of tolerance and downregulation of the 5-HT2A receptor. And in a way, this is nature providing a kind of some safety measures in there to make sure individuals don't take these compounds at too great a frequency, because the more you use, the less experience you have in a short period of time. If you look at some of these chemical structures, you see the structure of serotonergic 5-hydroxytryptamine, and you see that it is very similar to some of the classic structures of the classic hallucinogens, particularly psilocin, which is a metabolite of psilocybin. Psilocin is 4-hydroxy-N-N-dimethyl tryptamine, so very close to the serotonin structure. Then you see some of the other classic hallucinogens. Some of these share the feature that serotonin has of having an indole ring with a 5-sided with a nitrogen attached to it. Huh. Okay, so then looking at some of the some other non-classic hallucinogens that have relative import. Well, the first one is N-bomb, which is a phenethylamine, a 5-HT2A and 2C agonist, potent on a microgram level. The active dose is between 600 to 1200 micrograms, and it has very powerful hallucinatory effects and very dangerous effects. It can cause serotonin syndrome associated with confusional states, a lot of tremulousness. People can get very seriously ill. They can heat up quite a bit. And what we should all be aware of is that N-bomb has been used as an adulterant or a substitute on blotter paper for LSD. So, there have been a number of cases of deaths that were initially attributed to LSD, and it turned out on analysis to have been N-bomb. These were individuals who had serious overheating. Their internal temperature regulation mechanism broke down because of the N-bomb. So its substitution, is illicit substitution, or just substitution for LSD, is a very dangerous phenomena. And people who acquire LSD on the street who receive blotter LSD should be aware that there is some possibility that it might not be LSD at all, but substituted N-bomb, which is a far more dangerous compound. Then there's salvinorum A, which is the isolated diterpene from the plant Salvia divinorum. This is a sacred plant of indigenous people from the Mexican Central Highlands, in the Oaxaca region. It's curious, when Argor and Wasson went to explore rumors of a mushroom cult in Oaxaca, and really opened the door to psychedelic interest and study in the West. The native people, they told them all about, Maria Sabina told them all about their use of mushrooms, their understanding of mushrooms, how the spirits of the mushroom guide them, heal them, etc. But they failed to mention the salvia plant, which is a very important plant amongst indigenous people for healing, for connecting to their ancestors. But their model of ingesting is very different. They will take 10, 15 leaves of the salvia plant, wad it up into a little ball, deposit it in the back of their mouths, and let it just gradually dissolve over the next 20 minutes or so, with the active chemical compounds absorbed through the buccal mucosa in the mouth. Whereas in the West, we have a need for rapid onset, intense experience, and so an enterprising Western chemist, an American chemist, isolated the diterpene salvinorin A, and that is an extremely powerful causes an extremely powerful dissociative experience. Most users find it unpleasant, to the point where most people who've taken it that I'm familiar with have not elected to take it more than once or a couple of times. So it's a very interesting compound, but not without its risks. And then there's ketamine, it becoming increasingly well known. It's a dissociative anesthetic, an approved anesthetic used for many years in the pediatric surgeries, burn surgeries, where you want to avoid respiratory depression, which ketamine has very limited respiratory effects, making it safer in that regard. It is an abusable compound. Its effects are very alluring to some people, to the point where they cannot leave it alone. I've actually been involved in interventions with doctors who had a true ketamine psychological dependence syndrome, were using ketamine every day, couldn't function, were a hazard behind the wheel on the road, and whose partners were very concerned about their deterioration. Ketamine also has a possible role as a therapeutic agent in psychiatry, as it alleviates depression, but the question there is for how long. Most indications are that the antidepressant effects of ketamine last a week or two, and then you're more or less back at baseline. There may be ways to get around this, but I think we need, is it the optimal compound? It's an easy drug to administer in the office. It's a lucrative treatment for the practitioner, but is the therapeutic impact sufficient? And also looking at the risk-benefit ratio, which often does not get done. I think there's not an adequate appreciation of the degree to which ketamine can induce a psychological dependence, leading to excessive use patterns. Then there's MDMA, 3,4-methylenedioxymethamphetamine. I've done some MDMA research over the years. We were the first group that got permission back in 93 to study a population of normal volunteers with kind of a dose-finding study of MDMA, and finding it was well tolerated until we got to the upper dose limits. And there we had some blood pressure concerns, which were easily treated. Nevertheless, pointed out that blood pressure is something that needs to be examined very carefully with when people are on MDMA. MDMA has also gotten a good deal of attention for a series of studies that have demonstrated strong efficacy in individuals being treated for chronic refractory post-traumatic stress disorder. Some very nice work coming out of the MAPS organization, led by Michael Mithofer, and this drug is is likely to become the first drug that has a shot at that kind of legal or being taken out of Schedule 1 to allow it to be used in treatment settings, even outside of a research context. That's likely to kind of precipitate some conflict, some discussion, some debate. But again, some very, very good research with MDMA. Although one needs to be very careful about drug substitution issues, about overheating problems with adulterants or with MDMA itself. Quality of MDMA sold on the street is variable. I've seen some HPPD, hallucinating persistent perceptual disorder, with individuals who take a lot of MDMA of likely poor quality. So, but again, an agent that's likely to have a therapeutic range. Ibogaine, the active alkaloid from the iboga plant used by a cult in Western Africa, in Gabon, the Bwiti cult. It's an ancestral religion. The goal of the experience with Ibogaine is to have a vision of an ancestor. So it's an ancestor-based religion, and really, in a sense, the thrust of this religion, the Bwiti cult, is to basically eliminate individuals' affects to Western religion, Western culture that was foisted on them by colonists in previous centuries, and get back to their roots and develop kind of a syncretic ancestor worship relationship. Ibogaine is a very interesting compound. It has been used as an addiction interrupter, although it does have some risk of cardiotoxicity, and there have been some high-profile fatalities there. The plants, most psychedelics we're familiar with are derived from plants. There are a couple of exceptions, and most have plant antecedents or came to us through plants. Start with psilocybin cubensis, first made aware to the West by R. Gordon Wasson's articles in Life magazine in 1957 after his visit to Oaxaca, and the time he spent with a Mexican curandera, Maria Sabina, who introduced him to mushrooms, to psilocybin mushrooms. He then, when he left, Maria Sabina gave him some samples of the mushroom, which he sent to the leading medicinal chemists around the world at that time. This would have been the mid-late 50s. None of them could kind of break the code or discover what the active alkaloid was until Albert Hofmann, the famous Swiss natural products chemist who had earlier discovered LSD. He was the one who first identified psilocybin as the active alkaloid in mushrooms. Lophophora-williamsi is peyote, from which mescaline is derived. Mescaline has been utilized in studies in the early 50s, not so much recently, I think in part because it has a very, very long duration of action, and it's just logistically more challenging. Peyote has been used very productively to enhance health within the context of Native American groups. The Native American Church uses a peyote sacrament, and illustrious leaders in psychiatry, going back to Carl Menninger in the 50s, commented that of all the interventions thrown at the native people because of the alcoholism problem, that the Native American Church and peyote were the only treatments that appeared to have any efficacy. So a very strong association of peyote and mescaline to treatment there. Claviceps purpura is a fungus that grows on rye, an ergot fungus, and it contains lysergamine, similar in effect to LSD, which is lysergic acid diethylamide. Okay, so here's plants of great interest to me. These are the plants that constitute ayahuasca. These are the plants that Jace Calloway and I studied with our colleague Dennis McKenna back in the early 90s in the Brazilian Amazon. We did the first formal biomedical psychiatric examination of the range of effects of ayahuasca. We were invited by a syncretic religion, the União Vegetal, the UDV, to study long-term members of their church. So here are the plants that go into making ayahuasca. If you take either of these plants alone, that's Psychotria viridis, contains DMT, Banisteriopsis absciscapi contains the monoamine oxidase inhibiting harmine, harmaline, and tetrahydroharmine. If you administer these, if you brew them separately from one another and administer them to a human subject, there'll be no effect whatsoever, or virtually no effect. However, if you brew the two plants together in a rather complex multi-hour process, and you take off the distillate, you have a very potent kind of residual liquid, and that becomes ayahuasca. It has a very, very powerful, approximate 4-hour effect, visionary experience. So again, we spent about a month in Manaus in Brazil in '93 studying these plants, studying the range of effects, collecting a great deal of data, which we published through the '90s in about 5 or 6 different publications in the mainstream psychiatric, medical, and pharmacological literature. So and then back in 2001, I returned to Brazil to conduct a study with the adolescent progeny of members of the União Vegetal. These were kids who were often exposed in utero, were baptized with ayahuasca as babies, but then generally did not participate until they reached puberty, when they were offered the opportunity to attend special family ceremonies with their parents and their grandparents, and to have an ayahuasca experience. We did a study evaluating the psychological well-being and overall functional status of these kids. We had a control group that we also worked up, and found these young people to be very, very highly functional, very, very impressive young people who, if there were differences between the two groups, really were that the kids who had been exposed to ayahuasca were far less likely to use and abuse substances like alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, other possibly, potentially dangerous substances, less likely than the control kids. And they had less overall anxiety, were more socially at ease. So we know that plant hallucinogens have been used since antiquity. There's evidence going back 7,000 to 9,000 years. This is a cave drawing. Actually, it's a drawing of a cave painting. This drawing was done by Kathleen Harrison, and you could see this is known as the bee shaman. You can see the beehive mass. In the ancient world, there was no refrigeration. So to preserve plant products or fungal products, it was noted that honey can be a good preservative. So the association here with honey, you see mushrooms kind of coming off of the limbs of the torso, the beehive mask. Clearly a shamanic figure. Elsewhere in that cave painting, there are numerous cattle, as mushrooms are often, they're coprophilic. They grow on cow patties, and so there's that close association. So mushrooms were clearly utilized by ancient peoples in all likelihood all over the world. So we're relative newcomers to this field, and honestly, we have to acknowledge that it's the indigenous peoples, the ancient peoples, who are the true experts, and sadly, much of their knowledge has been lost to time. But there's still, still much that we are learning, and that really should inform us as we develop our new understandings of psychedelics and our new understandings of how they may be utilized. So in the far ancient, this would be pre-Neolithic world, they were used for religious and medicinal purposes of healing and for spiritual ecstasy, let's say, informing the basis for their belief system and their culture. They were used for initiation rites and used by diverse cultures around the world, and had a profound influence on religion, philosophy, and art, even though in many respects this has been quite unknown and a bit of a revelation. So range of effects of hallucinogens, they impact, alter perception, mood, cognition, but otherwise leaving a very clear sensorium. Their sustained alterations of consciousness can cause visual illusions and internal visionary experience. Very rarely frank hallucinations. When we did our study in Brazil, we had an instrument called the hallucinogen rating scale developed by Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico, and our subjects objected to taking that instrument because they were adamant that ayahuasca did not cause hallucinations. So, but rather it was a visionary compound. So it was interesting to discuss with them the distinctions between the two. Hallucinogens cause synesthesia, where different perceptual experiences are processed in a very, very kind of unexpected ways, like seeing sound or associating, well, just different elude me right now, but different perceptual kind of switching up, and they induce often an experience of union with others and the natural world. União vegetal, which we studied, the religion we studied, the translation of união vegetal is union of the plants. They would talk about union of the plants and the people. So union and being in harmony, very important. These experiences are not dissimilar to dreams, spontaneous epiphanies, and also psychotic states in certain respects. There's a preservation of orientation, memory, and ego identity, and what's critical to outcome, and which is an important take-home lesson for us in the modern world working with these compounds, is the importance of optimizing set and setting. Set is mental expectations, psychological disposition, psychological vulnerabilities, expectations, intentions. A very important issue is their intention, what they hope to get out of the experience. And then setting is where you take it, who you take it with, how safe things are, the expertise of the facilitators. They're all important in determining outcome. I have to apologize for that noise. There's a lot of construction work going on in the vicinity. Let me close the window. Okay. A little better. I apologize. It's probably bothering me more than it's bothering you. Okay, a very important book, one of my favorite books. Lester Grinspoon, on the faculty at Harvard Medical School for many years, examined all of the collected research on psychedelics starting in the late 40s through the early 70s. It's a tremendous compendium of the work that was done. And in my mind, this was the golden age of psychedelic research, 50s and the 60s. And there's tremendous enthusiasm that we were on the ready to enter a whole new field of understanding mental phenomena, mental disturbance, understanding how to treat it. But things obviously went awry when because of the culture wars of the late 60s and early 70s. But in the 50s and 60s, over 1,000 clinical papers were published on psychedelics in the professional literature discussing the experiences of some 40,000 patients and research subjects who had been treated with psychedelics or hallucinogens. Some of the areas which showed, I think, the most promise, especially alcoholism, one of the most difficult, notoriously frustrating areas to treat in all of medicine. It was found that alcoholics, even after just one experience with a powerful classics psychedelic, were able to establish sobriety and maintain their sobriety for many years. Also, some studies looking at particularly opioid addiction, and a new study I'll mention later at Alabama looking at treatment of cocaine addiction as well. Other applications, psychosomatic disorders, chronic PTSD, I mentioned that in relation to MDMA treatment, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, notoriously one of the hardest conditions in psychiatry to treat, but some very hopeful preliminary data generated at both University of Arizona and Yale University, finding a therapeutic response to treatment, psilocybin treatment at Arizona and Yale, and back in the 60s, LSD, often finding that one had to push the dose to a rather high-end level to get the desired response, but was finding a significant improvement in individuals. Back in 1980, there's a very interesting letter to the editor in the American Journal of Psychiatry, one of the major journals in mainstream psychiatry, by a big figure at NIMH, Judith Rappaport, describing a young man who presented with history of severe OCD, but who reported that his OCD significantly ameliorated for weeks at a time after he would have a mushroom experience or an LSD experience. So very important clues, which unfortunately were not pursued at that time because of the taboo regarding this field, but gratifying to see in the modern era, the Arizona and the Yale groups moving forward, looking at OCD. Antisocial behavior, study at Alabama by Peter Hendricks, who did the cocaine study, but he also found that he had permission to go through the Alabama prison records, state of Alabama prison records, and finding that there was a significantly reduced recidivism rate, meaning return to prison after release, less return to prison after release in individuals who had had at least one psychedelic experience prior to their incarceration, not related necessarily to the incarceration, but prior to the incarceration. So an interesting potential for addressing the antisocial behavior issue. A famous study at Harvard with Tim Leary and Ralph Metzner in the early 60s purported to show a very positive effect with LSD treatment, but then Rick Doblin came along in the 90s and did a kind of a post hoc analysis and review of what happened, and found that the methodologies were kind of too flawed to make any definitive conclusions. So then there's autism. There's some early work with children in the going back to the late 50s with Loretta Bender, into the 60s with Gary Fisher and some others, finding they had very interesting reports, although the diagnostic standards of that day are very different than currently. And they But very hard politically, I think, to pursue treatment with children. But children grow up, they become adults, and we actually did a study about what year is this? Maybe about 8 years ago, using an MDMA treatment model in young adults over 21 who were on the autism spectrum and had incapacitating social anxiety. So we were targeting the social anxiety, and we had a good treatment effect. So it was a placebo-controlled double-blind study with that. We were not out to treat the core autism itself. That's in the hard wiring, but the kind of the not infrequent social anxiety, which incapacitates even highly kids who have high function in various areas, but could not attend school because of their anxiety. We found that after our treatment, our subjects at least showed a rather dramatic improvement, and this has been replicated in a couple of other areas. And then finally, treatment of the existential anxiety and terminal cancer. This is an area that really reading about Stan Grof's work in the 60s, early 70s that he conducted in Spring Grove, Maryland, working with terminal cancer patients, was very kind of got me thinking in large part to maybe going into psychedelic research if that opportunity ever presented. And we did pilot the first study of this sort in the modern era using psilocybin to treat advanced cancer anxiety. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but this is one of the more promising areas in psychedelic treatment, and an area where conventional treatments often come up short. Keep in mind, that's an important thing to keep in mind. So in the 90s, several investigators, including our group at Harbor UCLA, Strassman at Miami, Strassman at New Mexico, Deborah Mash at Miami, and then in our ayahuasca work, Jace Calloway, Dennis McKenna, and myself. These were the first phase 1 studies, normal volunteers for the most part, FDA approved in the early 90s. And getting FDA approval at that point in time, it took quite a while, and was I think a notable achievement. The field obviously couldn't have gone forward if the regulatory agencies hadn't taken another look at these compounds and determined that they might be studied under controlled, optimal conditions. So there you have that. Very important series of studies at Hopkins by the recently departed Roland Griffiths, looking at at psilocybin facilitating a powerful mystical level experience. It's important on a couple of issues. One is that it's replicable. You can reliably induce psychospiritual experiences with psychedelics if you reliably control your conditions. And we also know from work, even going back to Humphrey Osmond in the late 50s, that subjects, whether it's in the cancer anxiety studies or the alcoholism treatment studies, subjects who during the course of their many hour-long psychedelic treatment, and it was sometimes just one treatment these patients had, if they had a powerful spiritual level experience, they were more likely to have a positive therapeutic outcome. So if you control conditions and reliably facilitate powerful spiritual experience, and a spiritual experience is associated with a positive therapeutic outcome, I think you've got a very interesting psychological mechanism to work with there. Again, the individuals who had a powerful psychospiritual experience more likely to have long-standing therapeutic outcome. And Bill Richards and Walter Pankey kind of define what these altered states as psychedelic peak experiences, and they would entail a sense of unity or oneness, transcendence of time and space, deeply felt positive mood, a powerful sense of awe and reverence, a powerful sense of meaning and purpose, but ineffability, very hard to put words afterwards to the experience. Paradoxicality, kind of what you think is going on may not be what's going on, maybe something very different. And a transiency. While you're in the experience, it's as if it's been going on forever, but once it's over, it's as if it went in the flash of an eye. It's an interesting kind of time sense of time distortions. So it's phase 2 psilocybin studies. I think we kind of started that off doing our piloting the psilocybin treatment of cancer anxiety. Our work was replicated by 2 other groups. We gave our protocol to the NYU group led by Steve Ross, and he got permission for a slightly higher dose. We actually went in to FDA asking for a high dose, and they said, look, nobody's worked with this compound in decades. Far more prudent and careful, and it made more sense to them if we would start off with a lower dose. So we kind of debated this back and forth, ended up with 0.2 milligrams per kilogram body weight, and we're satisfied. It was not a knock your socks off dose, but it was a sufficient enough dose for people to have an experience, and we had very good outcomes. But and then Steve Ross did a very similar study with a slightly higher dose, and then Roland Griffiths, he used a very different protocol than our protocol, and he got permission to use the highest dose. And both the NYU and the Hopkins studies, all 3 studies showed had therapeutic outcomes. The slightly higher dose was more likely to achieve that. They were all placebo controlled. Our study and the NYU study used niacin as an active control. In retrospect, I wouldn't use niacin again. We had a couple of people who had extreme niacin sensitivity. They turned beet red, were itching like crazy. It was a rough hour, and clearly it broke the blind. Everyone knew what they were on. With other subjects, it was an acceptable blind, but we have not used niacin since, and I wouldn't recommend it. Hopkins, on the other hand, used a very low dose psilocybin as their placebo. I find that problematic because even a low dose psychedelic can induce a strong enough effect that it could have a therapeutic impact. And so that's I had a critique about that. And in all of these studies, all the subjects acted as their own control. I felt that's the optimally ethical approach to take with people who are approaching end of life. You don't want to get their hopes up that they're going to have perhaps a powerful psychedelic experience and then end up with a placebo. That could be very, very demoralizing. And so everyone got 2 sessions in these studies. One was with psilocybin, the other was with whatever control was being utilized, and everyone got 2 sessions. The psilocybin on one, a placebo on the other, but it was the order that was randomized and blinded. So you were blinded as to what condition they were receiving, but you knew they would get one of each. So we provided preparatory therapy. We utilized for our study at Harvard crossover methodology. Our control was niacin, a moderate dose of psilocybin in an NIMH funded research unit at Harvard UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. And we follow up evaluations going out over 6 months and some integrative therapeutic sessions as well to help them process their experience. And one important point for this is when you work on preparation, you talk about, you ask the patient, what is your intention? What do you hope to get out of this experience? And usually it has to do with healing, relationship healing, maybe dealing with illnesses, asking questions, needing insight, trying to regain a sense of purpose and meaning to one's life. And then during the integrative sessions, you talk with the subject as to you remind them of what their stated intentions were to have this experience, and then you review with them to what degree were those intentions met or not. And more likely than not, even if the subject was not aware during the experience, those intentions were addressed. You need a reasonably nice environment to administer these substances. We had a very kind of unaesthetic, bare, stark, standard hospital room, but along with my research colleague, we would always fix it up the evening before a session to kind of cocoon people in their bed, and it turned out to be a pretty nice environment. So here were all of our subjects in our study. It turns out 11 of the 12 subjects turned out to be women. I'm not sure what the reason for that was. It's just the luck of the draw, or maybe our female prospective subjects were more courageous than our males. Who knows? It just could have been timing. But you could see that their primary diagnoses, 4 of them had breast cancer, 3 colorectal, colon cancer, 2 ovarian cancer, 1 each multiple myeloma, salivary gland cancer, and peritoneal cancer. And you can see duration of cancer and how it's metastasized. Everyone was quite ill. Everyone passed within a couple of years. This was our publication, the Archives of General Psychiatry, at that time the #1 impact journal in the field, subsequently renamed JAMA Psychiatry. So we were very gratified. This was a long shot to submit a clinical paper on psychedelics after decades of it being a taboo. It's a long shot to submit it to such a high impact journal, but they liked it, they took it, and I think it helped move the field. Some of our data, looking at the Beck Depression Inventory, looking not a placebo contrast, but just looking at all the subjects cumed together after their psilocybin session. You could see that the noticeable improvement in mood, reaching significant proportions at the 6-month point. Here is the Spielberg State Trait Anxiety Inventory. Looking at state, there was no significant findings, but looking at trait anxiety, which is how you, looking back over the last 2 weeks, how anxious have you been? You can see on the right, the trait anxiety is noticeably improving fairly quickly, reaching significant proportions, and then that improvement being sustained over the 6-month follow-up period. So we were very gratified to see not only that we could establish and ensure safety, but that there were some signals for efficacy. This is not a definitive study. We had a modest N of only 12 subjects, but certainly this signal or indication that there might very well be efficacy along with the safe parameters we observe, I think, established that this could be a viable treatment model, and subsequently other studies working with a similar population have also found this to be the case. Here's one of the other this is the NYU publications led by Steve Ross and Tony Bossis. Tony Bossis is actually a collaborator on our very new study. They found they used a slightly higher dose and had slightly better outcome than we did. An even better outcome yet was the Hopkins study led by the late Roland Griffiths, but using a very different placebo control, but still really, Roland was a very fine career researcher, and really he helped, I think, establish greater rigor of the studies being conducted. And his loss, of course, it's a true loss to the field. Other studies in the modern era that have been conducted, some very good work on treating alcohol abuse disorder by Michael Bogenschutz, first when he was at University of New Mexico and later when he moved to NYU. These are ongoing studies he's got going. treatment of cocaine and crack addiction at Alabama by Peter Hendricks. This is a very important study because most of his subjects are low socioeconomic class, people of color, and then most of the studies historically with psychedelics have been with middle class, upper middle class, Caucasian subjects. So it's important to have diversity in your subject selection. So that's so the inclusion of the Alabama work in the field, I think, is very helpful. Not only demonstrating that there may be efficacy, as his preliminary results are indicating, but he also studied subjects that other studies have not studied. A very interesting smoking cessation study at Hopkins, led by Matt Johnson. It's very recently moved from Hopkins to Shepherd Pratt Hospital in Baltimore, and finding a quite remarkable degree of smoking cessation in people after a psilocybin treatment, and then treatment of depression at Imperial College London. This has been the major psychedelic research hub in the UK and one of the leading psychedelic research centers in Europe. This is one of their studies. This is actually funded by a private entity called Compass Pathways, looking at a single dose psilocybin treatment of resistant depression. They found the high dose, 25 milligrams, to be superior to placebo, or a low dose, 10 milligram. And yet there were problems with this study. There was some suicidal acting out, as reported in the publication that came out of the study, and that was unusual for these. They're the first studies to report suicidal ideation, suicidal behavior in subjects. Not many, a few of them, but still enough to take notice of. And this may have to do with this is a private entity. They're looking to get a patent on psilocybin treatment once that is possible. And they are also, in my view, focusing on how to best augment profit. And one way to do that is to lessen the degree of preparation and integration, and have lower standards for facilitators. For instance, not necessarily having the health professional, mental health professional who was involved in the preparation to be present and in the room on the day of the treatment. So, again, I think we need to optimize safety parameters, and I'm honestly, truthfully, I'm uneasy about the potential role of the private sector in developing psychedelic treatments, because there's going to be, competition to achieve control, and then the focus on optimization of profit and return on investment to the investors. Okay, enough of that. So the most advanced studies have been with the MDMA PTSD treatment. These are now in phase 3, and they are approaching, applying to the FDA to establish MDMA in an expanded access capacity and available to be used in treatment. So psilocybin, there's been a competition between two private companies, the for-profit Compass and the not-for-profit Usona. And again, the for-profit model with psychedelics leaves me uneasy. I'll say, I think I've said enough. And again, both of these treatment models have achieved from the FDA breakthrough therapy status, which really facilitates their progress through the bureaucracy of the regulatory agencies. It's very helpful, and a sign that the regulatory agencies are very open and receptive to evaluating these studies, and when indicated, to give approval to their being conducted. And only recently has NIH provided any funding. A couple of studies one at NYU in Colorado, looking at cancer anxiety, and another at Yale, NIMH study at Yale, looking at OCD, treatment of OCD, and let's see, there was another one. I think that was it. So getting back to our, a paradigm shift. Are we ready for a paradigm? Well, what's our conventional paradigm psychopharmacology? It's generally giving the same drug, or multiple drugs on a daily basis for weeks, months, and years. Often these med regimens do not get reevaluated, or it takes some time. So, and the efficacy is really, I think, all things considered, given what the hopes were back in the late 70s and early 80s, I think the outcome with these standard treatments is somewhat disappointing in terms of the large numbers of people who just simply do not respond to conventional treatments. So the underlying premise is to ameliorate a presumed pathologic brain state, and relief of symptoms is not necessarily dependent on patient's attitude or insight. But then what is a paradigm shift? What would we be shifting towards? Let's consider feasibility of a psychedelic psychopharmacology paradigm. In this model, the drug may be administered only once in one's lifetime, or on a couple or a few occasions, spaced out over time within the context of an ongoing psychotherapy. And the treatment loosens defenses, facilitates insight, may induce a mystical level experience, which might be associated with a greater degree of efficacy in terms of outcome. These are carefully monitored. You can see there are two facilitators in the room with the subject, and there should be someone with eyes on the subject at all times. Very important. Safety be maintained, and that includes keeping an eye on your subject so they don't open their eyes, find themselves in an empty treatment room and wander out and then can't be found. And believe me, that could happen, and it has happened. Not with us, but with another group, with so there you have it. So, and then it's within the context of ongoing supportive psychotherapy. Emphasis on, preparatory, the actual session, and then integrative afterwards. A very important development in this field was a publication of Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. Michael Pollan is considered a leading writer in the U.S. He's a celebrity writer. Whatever Michael Pollan writes about or has to say gets listened to very attentively. And he wrote this book on psychedelics. He had kind of a conversion experience, very skeptical about psychedelics earlier in his life, and then decided, for whatever reason, to delve into it more thoroughly, toured around the country to interview various people researching psychedelics, and wrote this book, which very rapidly became a #1 New York Times bestseller. And what Michael Pollan writes about gets taken very seriously. So I think that was a tipping point in the whole issue of how psychedelics are perceived by our culture. And subsequently, psychedelics in various locations have actually been decriminalized, starting in Denver, and then Oakland and Santa Cruz, and now other cities and states around the country. A couple of states, Oregon and Colorado, have essentially de facto legalized. They have decriminalized certain psychedelics, particularly plant psychedelics. And this is an entirely new and somewhat surprising development. But what does it all mean? What are the implications of decriminalization? Certainly there's some concern that look, the drug war in my mind has been a colossal failure. It really has caused far more harm than good. We need to find something different, but the sudden proliferation of legal mushrooms in the modern world does not come without risk. And one issue is, what do people know about psychedelics? have they been adequately educated? So there needs, if this is going to be how our societies are moving, we need to provide good public education for people so they understand what these compounds are, what the risks are, who are good candidates for taking mushrooms, and who might be vulnerable to having adverse outcomes and should stay away from these compounds. People need to understand you never, ever, under any circumstances, mix psychedelics with alcohol, that you need to also be concerned even about mixing with other compounds like cannabis. It's commonly done, but could be problematic in certain contexts, but certainly mixing it with alcohol is a recipe for absolute disaster. And periodically I get consulted by by lawyers who have forensic cases, and I hear about these just outrageous, scary situations that have occurred when individuals on a psychedelic also decide, usually impulsively, to start drinking alcohol. Things can go off the rails very quickly there. So there needs to be good education. We can't persist with this blanket taboo, this blanket prohibition. It simply doesn't work, and it often leads to more dangerous. But we also need to take steps to make sure that risks are mitigated. The risks are reduced to as much as possible. And I could tell you stories how things could go wrong out in the world, but you probably know these stories yourself. So it's wonderful that we're reaching the point where psychedelics are becoming more acceptable. Their potential value is being recognized, and there's plans to move forward looking at therapeutic applications. But we also can't shirk our obligation, our responsibility to be cognizant of potential adverse outcomes and understanding how to mitigate those concerns, those risks. So the regulatory agencies have done remarkable evolution from where they were some years ago, which was very hostile to psychedelics, where they would shoot down any protocol that came within shooting distance, to currently where the FDA is very receptive, very interested, and very willing to work with investigators to conduct optimal protocols that get approved. And so I'm impressed. Why this is the case, having been to a number of meetings with the FDA, I can tell you, these are very capable people, and they're younger people. They're not people who grew up with Tim Leary like my generation did. And in fact, some people may not even have much of a sense of who Leary was, but Leary is no longer the obstacle he once was, because I think we've got a younger generation coming into positions of authority who are willing to take a fresh look and not be encumbered by the biases and events and the views of the past. So that's what I'll say there. I've had this picture up here. I just thought it was so cool that at FDA they've got a poster announcing a psychedelics conference with a picture of Maria Sabina, Claudia Naranjo, a Chilean investigator from some time ago, Albert Hoffman, pictures of ayahuasca, psychedelic mushrooms. Just thought it was so cool, I took it home. Okay. And philanthropic money is starting to open up, thank God, because we've been running this field on a dime for years. Hopkins received a multi-million-dollar grant from donors. They have their own Psychedelic Research Center. Similarly, Mass General, two of the leading hospitals in the country, and other centers as well. At UCLA, we're establishing a psychedelic research initiative, which is not only supported by our chairwoman, but also she's very interested, very much involved in the planning meetings, and this is the case in other academic medical campuses around the country. But the private world is not to be denied, and there's been tremendous investment and I think overvaluation of these companies. But needless to say, this I believe poses a risk to the integrity of the field and to ensuring that optimally safe studies are run. So I'll talk now about my current study that it's in preparation. It's an end-of-life study, be a multi-site study, 5 sites around the country, looking at end-of-life in the palliative care setting. It'll be a collaborative effort between mental health, psychiatry, and palliative care and oncology. And so, the one thing that we know for sure, with no exception, everybody dies. We're all born into this world, and the one thing we have in common is there'll be an end point. And sadly, many people who are approaching the end are in tremendously disturbing states of existential suffering. 35% of adults with serious life-threatening illness have clinical demoralization. So it's far, greater problem than depression, as we might have thought. Standard treatments of antidepressants and psychotherapy have their limitations. Antidepressants often don't work. They're sometimes slow to work. There's limited evidence, particularly in this population. Psychotherapy is, it's speed is plus minus, and there is significant cost and complicated logistics. And then there's psychedelic treatment, which offers the potential advantage of being a rapid onset treatment, but it's also got its own unique set of risks, but it's involved with meaning making. I think that the true value is this is existential medicine. It can, for someone who's lost their sense of purpose, meaning, and even sense of self, sense of identity, who they are, who they've always been, there can be a relative degree of restoration with an optimally run psychedelic treatment. Just different studies around the country that have looked at end-of-life patients using a psychedelic model. There's our study at Harvard, UCLA, the NYU study, Hopkins, and UCSF did a study looking at HIV survivors, men who had contracted HIV and who attended to the passing of their social networks because it was such a lethal disease early on, but who survived and now had tremendous residual guilt and depression. Very interesting study run by Brian Anderson at UCSF, demonstrating very good response to a psilocybin model. So, looking at our psilocybin treatment in the palliative care setting, looking at it'll be a multi-site study. We've got 5 sites that are committed. We're hoping to treat between 100 and 120 patients in pragmatic kind of real-world settings, real-world providers. 3 of the treatment sites are academic settings, and 2 are cancer treatment settings without a strong academic affiliation. So that makes it kind of more pragmatic as how this might be delivered in the real world. We're looking at a moderately high dose, and we clinically tailoring it to the presentation and the status of the patient. The average dose will probably be around 25 milligrams. We're using an active control, a low to moderate dose liquid ketamine ingested orally. After, when the blind is broken, after a few months, individuals who received the active placebo ketamine for their first go-round will be eligible to an open label psilocybin treatment if they so desire. They don't want to, they've had enough, if they're not up for it, their condition has worsened, so they can't have another session. They don't have to have one, but if they so desire, it's available. Given the status of these individuals are approaching the end of life, they might be very hopeful about a psychedelic experience. We didn't feel it was ethical to deny anyone that experience, even though scientifically we maintaining that blind throughout ongoing creates stronger data. Nevertheless, we did not want to deny these people this experience. We utilize a meaning and purpose therapy developed by some Australian psychologists working with their palliative setting patients. reinstilling meaning and purpose, and we felt it was a good fit for this study. And outcomes, the primary outcome measure was demoralization, secondarily depression, anxiety, quality of life, spiritual status, and pain experience. So my last slide, on the right, you can see these little guys. They're sacred mushroom stones from Central America from a millennia ago. And I kind of like to think they're looking out over the modern world and telling us, okay, now that the great mysteries have been opened up to modernity, are you going to be responsible? Are you going to use these compounds in an optimal way? Because there is so much at stake, including the survival of this planet. There needs to be kind of planetary change in many respects. And there's tremendous unmet needs for people who are in great distress, various mental illnesses, or simply reactivity to the trials and tribulations of living in this world. So basically, these mushroom deities are telling us, make sure we have our acts together when we work with their sacred compounds. So we need to implement the lessons of the past. That's both from shamanic models, from ancient, prehistoric, indigenous people, as well as the lessons of the past of the prior generation who worked with psychedelics, who studied psychedelics, were so excited about their potential in the 50s and the 60s. A goal in our work is to make sure we optimize safety parameters, and we also optimize ethical parameters. There have been some ethical breaches in the field over the years that cannot be replicated because can be very damaging to subjects who get ensnared in these situations, and it can be very damaging to the field as well. So very strong boundaries are a necessity when conducting these treatments. We need to make sure that we don't have a replication of what happened in the 60s, when the secret of psychedelics got out of the lab, got out of the treatment setting, got out of the research setting, and infiltrated throughout the greater society, including younger age populations. We don't need to see new waves of 14 and 15-year-olds experimenting with psychedelics, some of very poor quality, and many of these individuals not knowing much about these compounds, how to safely administer, and without the proper support. So we don't want to go through a replication of what was a public mental health crisis back in the 60s. And then there's the issue of microdosing. I honestly, I know there's a lot of excitement. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced that the effects of microdosing are anything other than a very good placebo response. There's very little data on microdosing, very little hard data. There's been one study, well-controlled, strong methodology study run out of the University of Chicago with Harriet DeWitt, which found no significant difference between those subjects with depression randomized into a microdose regimen versus those randomized into a placebo regimen. So, but doesn't mean it's not effective. It just means we don't know. The studies still have to be done. There's also some concern, though, with microdosing, with the frequent administration, like the once every 3 or 4 day model. There's this regular pulsing every few days. And, psychedelics, classic psychedelics, they not only are agonists for the 5-HT2A receptors, there are other receptors as well, including the 5-HT2B, which innervates the heart, the cardiac valves. And there's been some concern raised by people in our field, and I've raised it myself, that there could be some potential concern for development of cardiac arrhythmias if there's this chronic pulsing every few days with a microdose regimen. But again, that remains to be seen. There hasn't been enough research to date looking at issues like long-term cardiac effects. And I would like to see that, especially now that the field is opening up to older age subjects. In the past, we cut off our upper age limit, around 60 years of age or 65. Now we have no upper age limit. For this to be a pragmatic study, practically out in the world, that old generation that knows of psychedelics from the 60s, whether they took them or not, they were around, they're aware, they're also getting older, but some of them are very eager to have this experience, maybe to reinstill that sense of meaning and purpose. But we also need to understand how safe it is. So it's good that I think our study and other studies are opening up to older subjects, but we need to do our due diligence and really look carefully at safety parameters there. We've also found that it's quite feasible to effectively navigate regulatory obstacles, and that the regulatory people in the regulatory system are by and large very bright, very interested, and very interested in this topic, and very much willing to help us develop optimal protocols. That's a big change from the past. We need to look at funding options very carefully. I'll just say it one final time: beware the impact and the influence of the private for-profit world. It comes with all sorts of strings, including dropping levels of safety standards, and then expanded access. These compounds have been here for millennia. They go back to the prehistoric times. They've always been here, and now the legal process is opening up, really allowing people to have experiences, to have treatments. But we've got to handle this responsibly. We've got to put out responsible messages, and there needs to be some degree of oversight to make sure people know what they're doing and don't get themselves in unduly dangerous situations. So, oh my God, I talked a lot more than I planned to. So, but I've got a little extra time for questions and if you had any.
Yeah, thank you for a really interesting talk, Charles.
Okay.
And we have now some time for questions. And for those listening, thank you for the patience with the background noise. And it sometimes happens in life that there are noise sources that are beyond our control. And I would like to start with a question of mine, actually. And it gives you, or those listening, some time to write their questions. So, psychedelics like ayahuasca have been used in communal settings where common religious beliefs and values unite people together. And I want to ask, can we enable the full potential of psychedelics to alleviate human suffering without taking this communal aspect into account? And I'd be especially interested in insights you might have through conducting ayahuasca research in Brazil.
Well, in Brazil, when I spent time with the UDV, it was very clear that people do not take ayahuasca on their own. That it is always conducted in a group ceremonial setting, and I think the group provides a safe container, and really helps keep individuals grounded and focused. And so I think in many respects, a group model has advantages. I mean, there needs to be good monitoring of these groups. There needs to be at least a couple of people who have not been altered, who can keep an eye on people, make sure no one gets disoriented or agitated, and if so, addresses that. But especially working with plant material, I find the kind of historical or prehistorical models of group participation optimal. Now that being said, we have other models where it's individuals have that experience on their own, like the therapeutic model. There really hasn't been a group study, or the only group study like the one in San Francisco with the HIV survivors was individuals did their preparation as a group and subsequently their integration as a group, but the session itself was done in a room with one or two facilitators. So it was just the individual on his or her own with a couple of facilitators, not a group there. But yeah, but then, all of our psilocybin work with subjects has been individual work.
We have one question in the Q&A that's from an anonymous attendee. In a recent talk in Psychedelic 2023 conference, evolutionary anthropologist Manvir Singh from University of California talked about news related to the traditional use of psychedelics. One of the things he brought up was that there just isn't very good evidence for the view that the use of psychedelics has been widespread, spanning millennia. That besides the use of peyote in a very restricted areas, the use of mushrooms by Mazatecs, the evidence is very thin and therefore oversold. He didn't say that widespread use couldn't have occurred, just that the evidence is quite thin. Have you looked into Singh's work or otherwise engaged with viewpoints that challenge the claims that there is credible evidence of widespread historical use of psychedelics?
I agree that there's not a lot of hard evidence, but here we're looking at millennia, thousands of years, and time takes its toll. And much of the hard evidence, or at least some of it, a good chunk of it has disappeared over time. That being the case, I mean, a number of anthropologists, ethnobotanists, and others have really, like one of my favorite books, Plants of the Gods by Schultes and Hoffman, first published in the early 90s and then reissued more recently. I think they make a very compelling case that throughout time and around the world, most areas have psychedelic plants, at least prior to development, and the native peoples who would have intimate familiarity with their geographic area. They'd be intimately knowledgeable of the variety of plants. They would know which plants are nutritious, which plants are toxic, and which plants can induce visionary respects. Now, of course, we don't have a written account of psychedelic experience from several thousand years ago by indigenous people in shamanic settings. That's obviously would be an absurd notion, but I think from data like the cave paintings, not just that cave paintings, but other cave paintings around. This was a North African cave painting in Algeria, but there's been rich discoveries of cave paintings in France and Germany too. They've, I think, revealed a great deal. There have even been some discoveries in Central America, South America, the Caribbean of DMT-containing plants in implements where snuff would be insufflated or blow, instruments where one individual would be at one end of it and blow hard into it, and there'd be a plant material close to the other end, and the gust of air would blow it through into the recipient, who would have a powerful insufflated precipitated experience. There have been some archaeological finds there. So I'd agree with Dr. Singh that the evidence is not voluminous. It's not great, but I think there's sufficient hard evidence and certainly compelling rationales why there very well was widespread use of plant psychedelics for purposes of healing and for ceremonial, ritual, spiritual purposes, not for recreation. That was one constant. Yeah, it's so we know there are about 100. Schultes and Hoffman tell us were about 100 species of psychedelic plants, and no doubt we've lost knowledge of many others through the ravages of time and the history of this world.
Okay, thank you for your answer. The next question goes like this. Following up on your comments regarding Compass Pathways' drive to patent psilocybin utilizing therapy, recently there's been quite a bunch of critical discussions on profit-driven branches of psychedelic research. Do you think the potential harms of profit-seeking can be defended against when you take into consideration that profit-seeking entities just tend to have a lot more resources for research than non-profit ones? And is it enough that non-profit entities just keep doing their thing?
I'm not sure I'm following. So
if I understand the main point of the question, it's that could we defend from the potential harms of this profit-seeking when we take into account that the profit-seeking entities they also have like the financial resources to actually engage in research.
I wouldn't dismiss altogether the value of their work. They've got enormous resources, but it'll just be a matter of the rich getting richer and the poor going without. My concern is they will that the for-profit world will take control and really change the landscape of how of these compounds and their potential as medicines. You'd almost need an alternative entity like a government entity to take control of this process and to create an optimally fair approach where the goal wouldn't be to accrue profit, but to provide affordable, safe treatment. I mean, it's a wonderful way to make money, and I wouldn't want to, kind of put that down. Nevertheless, if we're going to optimize the potential value of psychedelics, I think the profit motive needs to be, kind of lessened, and more altruistic motives need to be kind of amplified.
Yeah, I completely agree. Then we have next question from Petteri Katajamäki. Perhaps you would like, Petteri, to read your question yourself.
Yes, and thank you for the presentation. But do you have any opinion about using psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy in treating personality disorders? And I'm especially interested in narcissistic and borderline disorders. Thank you.
Well, it was borderline, and what was the other one? Oh, narcissistic. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. A number of studies early on had excluded people with identifiable known personality disorder. Nevertheless, this can be a sizable percentage of the presenting patient population. I think very strong boundaries need to be maintained. One needs to be very vigilant with these patients, but certainly there's potential, particularly I think narcissistic disorders. These can be very humbling experiences, and in the process, narcissists may start looking outward as opposed to being so immersed in their their own sense of self. So I'd say it's been a relatively neglected area to date, but it certainly in the future will be a good target to look at in the context of an amplified psychotherapy. Like, what if you for instance, I'm doing a study now with some young investigators at UCLA where we're treating with psilocybin population of people with serious depression. And I'm losing my train of thought here. I'm getting tired. So these people receive CBT, and so they receive two mushroom experiences first, and then they get a CBT treatment. The idea is to see if the people who are randomized, actually it's open label, so if the psilocybin achieved greater efficacy after the CBT. One might do this with the DBT treatment as well. It'd be pretty daring, but eventually I think we're going to get there if the field keeps moving forward. You provide a psychedelic experience, and then you determine if that psychedelic experience set the stage for a better than expected therapeutic outcome of the subsequently administered DBT. That makes sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I'd like to read one of my questions now. In your view, what are the greatest risks of psychedelics? Philosopher Jules Evans has written about prolonged difficulties after psychedelic experiences, especially derealization and other dissociative symptoms. Do you have something to comment on these?
Yeah. It reminds me of the account of Jean-Paul Sartre's, I think, one and only mescaline experience, where he became terribly kind of disoriented and felt for weeks that walking down the streets of Paris, he felt at any moment the buildings would collapse on him. It threw him into a great existential crisis before the field of existentialism was really established. And I like to think that perhaps Sartre's bad trip led to many of his greater works and wrestling with this whole sense of meaning, of purpose. That's integral to kind of an existential awareness. So, what was the other part of the question? Rephrase it.
That what are the greatest risks of psychedelics on your assessment?
Yeah, so there I painted it in a positive picture. I think the greatest risk would be someone going into this with a significant psychological vulnerability without the necessary psychological supports, maybe on their own, taking it in unmonitored settings, maybe adverse settings, maybe taking a drug which is not particularly pure, maybe not even the drug that it's believed to be. All bets are off. I consulted years ago on a case, a very unfortunate case of a young man with no psychedelic use history that was known, no mental health problems that were known, but one day during his freshman year of college, he accessed some mushrooms, invited a couple of friends over, did not tell them he was on mushrooms, but he ingested the mushrooms, and then they went out walking in this very, very, intense metropolis, this city with, a tremendous degree of, noise and crowding and all the hustle bustle movement of a big city. And he ended up going into a university building, the library, and going up to the 10th floor and jumping to his death, seemingly in a very impulsive manner. I think he got very disoriented and panicked. And I think when someone panics with a troubling psychedelic experience, at the core of the panic is this sense of, oh my God, I've done something to myself, and I'll never regain my sense of self again. And the way if that's starting to happen, the way to intervene is to basically reassure the individual, reassure the patient that, okay, there's good news and bad news here. The bad news is you're having a rough time, and I understand that, and I'm sorry to hear that. But the good news is be patient, and the effects of the drug that's causing you to have this bad time. It's be patient. The effects of the drug are going to wear off pretty soon, and I can assure you, you're going to return to your sense of who you are, your sense of self, and just that level of reassurance can often really help to contain a potentially dangerous situation.
Thank you. We have one more question in the Q&A section. Would you comment on recent discussions regarding the necessity of subjective experience for the healing potential of psychedelics? What if we find out that most of the benefits can be gained without the psychoactive effects?
Oh, without the psychological effect? So it's just a biological effect?
If I understand the context of the question rightly, I think this is related to the finding that there are these so-called psychoplastogens, which
Right.
have this kind of effects that they make the brain more plastic in similar manner to psychedelics, but without the subjective effects.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting concept. I don't necessarily buy it. I even saw a proposal of where the patient would be put to sleep in some manner, maybe anesthetized, and then would have, I guess, injected into them a powerful psychedelic, and they would be asleep during the experience. Well, there's no good evidence to show that model would work, and it is launching into a bit of the unknown. You don't know what might come out of this experience. It almost reminds me of this novel from the 60s of a British writer, I think his name is Colin Wilson, called The Philosopher's Stone, of kind of looking at not necessarily drugs, but a surgical approach, kind of the unexpected long-term ramifications, could be very problematic. So I don't know. It just, it seems to me you're skirting by having a psychedelic experience without the psychedelic experience, you're avoiding the true potential value, which is to do a deep dive into your psychological sense of self, your spiritual sense of self, and learn about yourself. Learn about kind of the world around you, what your sense of true mission is, how you need to conduct yourself, what you can learn from the experience, how this experience can direct you to be a better person, a more ethical person. I think it does psychedelics a disservice, and in the end, I just don't buy that model.
Thank you. I'll have to agree with that answer. It seems that those kind of psychoplastogens don't really challenge the person to make sense of the experience, and in that way also to create room for change. But that's a complicated topic. One more question is that what worries you most regarding the mainstreaming of psychedelics? What are the most relevant, challenging questions that we don't have answers to, yet that keep you up at night?
Well, I think a concern that, again, with the for-profit, and one of the key elements of being a for-profit industry is you try to reduce costs. So with psychedelics, the way you reduce cost is to lower the standards you expect facilitators to have in terms of their education, expertise, their level of practice they engage in. It's facilitators who really are not qualified to do what they're doing, not only in terms of what kind of degrees they have, but who they are and their own kind of the ethical parameters, the ethical standards they carry with them. People on psychedelics can have a dissolving of boundaries, And when you're in a psychedelic experience, you may be more at risk for being imposed upon by someone who may want to, sexually engage someone on psychedelics. That's a concern that has happened in the past. That there have been reports of sexual molestations of subjects or participants in these experiences by the facilitators who are supposed to keep subjects safe and protected. That's a genuine concern. Another concern I have is, and I alluded to this earlier, what are the longstanding implications to cardiovascular function? With do we really have something to be concerned about with this 5-HT2B agonism with psychedelics? It simply hasn't been looked at, and I think we haven't looked at it in part because we don't necessarily want to get answers that could be challenging to deal with. But the fact is, we need to know about the relative cardiac risk. Are individuals who have taken a significant number of psychedelic sessions over the years, have they predisposed themselves to greater risk of developing arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation, which is, can be potentially quite dangerous?
I still have one question which I'd really like to ask, which is related to the very basics of what we have been talking about today. Psychedelics seem to have beneficial effects on many different forms of mental disorders, or in other words, different forms of human suffering. But what is suffering, and what is the relationship between psychedelics and the alleviation of it?
Yeah. Well, by suffering, we're alluding to somatic suffering. We're also alluding to psychological suffering and spiritual suffering. I mean, psychedelics offer the potential of having a powerful psycho-spiritual experience, which can be, very healing, but also can kind of reorient an individual and get them more focused again on who they are, who they've always been, kind of reconnect with their sense of self, and also endow them with a greater sense of meaning and purpose. There's something more to life than just walking around in pain, whether it be physical pain or psychological pain. Kind of a renewal. They sometimes talk about with psychedelic experience, people can have very powerful death, like psychological death, rebirth experiences. So it's that possibility, that opportunity, that potentiality of being reborn into a better integrated sense of self, with I believe a consequent alleviation of the attendant suffering that was there, which led to the person perhaps seeking out this experience.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it really takes an integrated self to deal with all the suffering that's involved with life. We still have one question our new question in the Q&A section. You referred to the research you did a couple of decades ago, where you measured the psychological performance and well-being of adolescents that partook in ayahuasca ceremonies in Brazilian syncretic churches. If psychedelic research has long been a taboo, psychedelics and adolescents are even more of a taboo. And as I understand it, FDA requires MAPS to do a phase 4 MDMA research on adolescents too. So how can such a research be done ethically? And since your research wasn't clinical study, but more observational, what do you think about clinical research involving adolescents?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and that's something I've been giving a lot of thought to lately. I've been asked by a junior investigator at UCLA to help her develop the study that MAPS would like to have done, which is to an MDMA treatment for minors with chronic PTSD. And my feeling was, I've always been adverse to working with minors, more for political reasons, also for some, certainly some safety issues. But I told her I'd be willing to consider helping develop a protocol that would focus on 16 and 17-year-olds. Right now, it's the age of consent is 18. So 18 and over can be in these studies, but it's under 18 where the questions still arise. So I said the first step would be, not to drop the age down to 12 or 13. I think that would be out of the question, at least at this point in time, but to the 16 and 17-year-olds who are, physiologically and even psychologically not that far from 18-year-olds who already, there's a little data and there's access to these studies. So I know the FDA has this requirement of, under examined populations being studied. But I when push comes to shove, I don't think the FDA is going to insist on taking the age level that lower than maybe 16 or maybe 15 at best. I don't see it going lower than that. I may be wrong, but that's my take. I think there's still a need on that particular issue to play it safe.
We're soon running out of time, but I have still two very quick questions and then a few closing words. You mentioned in your talk that there are some people who simply cannot leave ketamine alone. Why do you think that ketamine is such an alluring drug for some people?
That's a great question. I wonder about that a lot, and I don't have a great answer. I don't know. It's some people have described to me that sense of no longer being in their body, not being encased, entrapped in their body. That sense of freedom, even if it's almost illusory and transient, and even hard to remember afterwards. It is so revivifying, invigorating that people just simply prefer to be in that dissociated, altered state. But when they are in that, they've been in that state, and they a couple hours later want to get in their car to drive someplace, that's when it gets scary. So I have some close associates who are very enamored of ketamine, the ketamine treatment model, the intrasubjective experience themselves. But I just find with a certain population, including some very, very high functioning or people who had been very high functioning, there was this sense of they just could not leave it alone. They just had to keep going back. That they couldn't handle being in their bodies. They needed that tremendous release that ketamine can provide. I don't find ketamine particularly insightful. Doses I'm familiar with, I would have trouble understanding how one could engage in a therapeutic process, and the memory of whatever might be going through your mind under the influence of ketamine. That memory fades pretty quickly. So it's like, what are you really getting out of it other than a 45-minute or so release? But then after that, you got to go back into your somatic prison. Better, I think, to work on other techniques that would be sustained through your drug-free states, which ought to be the vast majority of the state of mind you're in.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. And I want to say that I really appreciate that you gave your time and were our guest today. And especially I want to thank you for giving us some extra time for questions. That's really kind of you.
Great. No, thank you for the invitation. I tell you, I was in Finland about 5 or 6 years ago. I love my time there. I'd love to come back. So and I very much enjoyed meeting the Finns that I met. And again, if my friends Jason, Anita are out there, special hello, and let's talk soon.
Thank you. And a few closing words for our members and other guests who are listening. So if you're not a member of Psytu yet, we invite you to consider becoming one. You can buy a support membership in our web store at our website. And if you're working or studying in an academic discipline relevant to psychedelic research, and currently carry out or are planning to carry out psychedelic research, or wish to actively advance such research, you may apply for a full membership, and you'll find more info and application form at our website. And we also accept donations, more info also on our website. And please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter to keep updated about our future events and other activities. And goodbye, everyone, and I hope to see you again in our future events.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see you all. And good luck with your work.
Thank you very much, and likewise.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Bye.